Wilberforce is starting out with Chapter 4, A New Life. Wilberforce planned to accompany his mother, sister, and two female cousins on a trip to the French Riviera in the late fall of 1784. The women were going to spend the winter there. Before he left on the trip, Wilberforce bumped into one of his favorite teachers from grammar school. Isaac Milner was a brilliant mathematician and scientist, and Wilberforce invited Milner to join him on the trip. He thought Milner would be a better conversation partner than the women would. And so that October, the two men rode in a separate carriage as they accompanied the women on their journey across Europe. While in France, Wilberforce absent-mindedly picked up a copy of a book one of his cousins had brought with her. The book was called The Rise and Progress of Religion. Milner saw it and commented, "That's one of the best books ever written." "You gotta be kidding," Wilberforce replied in disbelief. "A book on religion is one of the best ever written?" "Seriously," Milner replied. "As a matter of fact, I wouldn't mind reading it again on our way back to London." Wilberforce was astonished that Milner would say such a thing, but considering his admiration for Milner, he decided he would read it, and at Milner's urging, he agreed to discuss it as they rode along. By the time the men returned to London, the book had obviously made an impact on Wilberforce. He didn't behave any differently. His diary included the same kinds of notes it had always included. Sat up all night, danced until 5 in the morning, and so forth. But side by side with these notes, he began to make comments that were very different from any he had made before. So-and-so's christening. Laughter all around. Very indecent. Shocking dance at the opera, yet the audience unmoved. Strange that the most generous men and religious do not see their duties increase with their fortune. Wilberforce had started to evaluate his own life and the lives and behaviors of others. For the first time in his life, he began to think in moral and ethical terms. Late in the spring of 1785, Wilberforce and Milner returned to Europe to accompany the women on their trip back home. As they drove down to the Mediterranean Sea, the men read the New Testament from the Bible in Greek, and on the return, they talked. That fall of 1785, Wilberforce began a daily practice of reading the Bible and praying, and his religious concerns became so strong that early in December he decided to speak with the Reverend John Newton. Newton was well known among the wealthy as a religious enthusiast, and, as with Wilberforce's aunt and Uncle Thornton, Newton was someone whom any self-respecting person would avoid at all costs. But for some reason, Wilberforce never explained. He thought Newton could help him in some way. When the day came for his visit, Wilberforce was so afraid of being seen going into the Reverend Newton's home that he walked around the block several times before he got up the nerve to knock on the door. By the time he left, he had decided to become what he called a real Christian, someone who followed the teachings of Jesus. That evening, he decided to tell Pitt about what was on his mind. He wrote a brief letter to Pitt and said that he had devoted his life to God and was afraid the relationship would never be the same. Among the changes he said Pitt should plan for, "I expect soon to announce my resignation from the House." Pitt was alarmed. "Please," he wrote back, I want to hear what you're thinking, and let us discuss your ideas before you make any final decision about your continued service in the House." Wilberforce agreed, and when the two men met, they were able to talk openly about their thoughts and feelings. Wilberforce didn't convince Pitt to become a Christian, but Pitt convinced Wilberforce not to leave politics, at least for the time being. "Give yourself some time to think things through," he said, and Wilberforce agreed to do that. As it turned out, a few months later, Wilberforce was as great a presence in the House as he had ever been, but his relationship with Pitt had changed. Though their personal values and commitments remained close, their motives differed. For instance, when Pitt needed to make a decision about a bill, he always considered the good of the country and whether voters would like it. Wilberforce always asked a somewhat different set of questions. Is this right, according to his understanding of the Bible? Is this what God wants? Both men soon realized that Wilberforce would vote his conscience no matter what anyone else said or did. And because Pitt knew that Wilberforce would vote his conscience, he knew he could no longer speak as openly with Wilberforce as he once had. He had no longer felt as comfortable as he once had to share with Wilberforce all the intimate details about the parliamentary tricks and inside deal making he engaged in to get other MPs to vote with him on different matters. Besides the changes in Wilberforce, Pitt too became a significantly different man in 1785. With all the responsibilities of prime minister, Pitt became busier than ever with government matters. And so from that point on, these two former best friends drifted apart. Though they remained very friendly to one another, they never again acted quite as carefree and open with one another as they had before. So why did the relationship between Pitt and Wilberforce change in 1785? Chapter 5. A Changed Man. After deciding to follow Jesus, Wilberforce quit all 5 of the private clubs he had joined. The clubs where he had spent so many nights laughing, drinking, playing cards, and foining. The people who knew him best sensed that he was more serious about life than he had been, but they had no idea how much his thoughts and feelings had changed. All the pleasure he had once enjoyed when attending parties and dinners seemed to disappear. And how do we know? Because we can read his diary. How vain and foolish all the conversation of great dinners, nothing worth remembering, he wrote. Dined at Lord Chatham's, all the greats present. How unbecoming this feels to me. How unnatural for one who professes himself a stranger and a pilgrim. By contrast, then, there were comments like this. Dined at home. Milner and I had some serious talk. Despite his growing negative feelings, Wilberforce maintained positive relationships with those he had always spent time with in the past. He no longer tried to be the center of attention, but he did try to be a friend, and he participated in as much merrymaking with his friends as he felt he could. But he also began to do things that were more uniquely Christian. For example, he began to bow his head to say a prayer before every meal. He also tried to do good for his friends, as he put it, by trying to turn their conversations to spiritual matters. Unlike some enthusiasts who would turn their back in disgust on the kinds of people with whom he spent his time, Wilberforce always tried to be kindly, courteous, and engaging. Despite his good-natured kindness and courtesy, however, Wilberforce's mother expressed deep concern about her son's evangelical madness, as she called it. Wilberforce was quieter and more reserved than he had been at one time. It was true, but he was more considerate and even-tempered than he had ever been as well. Question: how did Wilberforce's life change after he became what he called a real Christian? Chapter 6. The abolitionist cause. So an abolitionist is someone who is absolutely against slavery. In the early 1700s, a few people were beginning to believe that slavery was morally wrong. As early as 1724, the Quakers passed resolutions that stated their beliefs in this regard. In 1761, they passed a resolution that said no one could be a Quaker if they participated in the slave trade. Primarily in response to the Quakers, but with the encouragement of some Wesleyans as well, Parliament considered several bills to abolish or severely cut back on the slave trade. But the House permitted every proposal to die without ever coming to a vote. Many leading Quakers were frustrated by this lack of action. Finally, in 1787, several men decided to form a national committee for the abolition of the slave trade. Most committee members were Quakers, but there were a few others as well. The committee set its first goal: to gather information about the horrors of the slave trade. Its second goal, and the reason for gathering the information, to make the people of England aware of the horrors. But if they wanted to achieve their ultimate goal and make the slave trade illegal, they realized they needed a friend in Parliament. They needed someone who would speak for them, someone who would act on principle rather than simply do what he thought would make voters happy, someone who would permit his name to be associated with the cause of abolition no matter what the cost, someone who could speak forcefully yet winsomely, someone who had the personal strength and reputation in Parliament that he could make one motion, then another like it, and another, as many as might be required. They needed someone who could present motions in such a way that they would not push the other MPs or members of Parliament away, but instead would hold their attention and even draw their interest. They needed someone who could present the evidence and reasoning for the motions in such a way that the members would realize how horrible the trade was. But he had to be able to talk in such a way that they wouldn't feel as if he enjoyed making the traders look bad. And the committee members realized that they needed to choose someone who had a good relationship with the prime minister. As we have seen, the prime minister made all the decisions about whether and how a bill came before parliament. If the prime minister opposed a bill, he could make it almost impossible to get the bill passed. As they discussed these things, the committee members realized William Wilberforce was the only man who met all the requirements, and so they asked him if he would help. They were thrilled when he said he would do everything he could to assist them. Little did he realize what a large commitment he had just made. Over the course of the next half year, Wilberforce worked closely with members of the committee. He consulted with his friend, Prime Minister Pitt, and he worked with other interested parties to gather as much evidence as he could about the trade. He needed all this information to present to Parliament. Well, only 2 or 3 years before, you would have found Wilberforce spending half the night drinking, singing, and dancing, and you could find him working with one or more of his friends, and they would spend that time discussing the evidence they could present to Parliament. Pitt himself was very interested in the project and was as involved in the process as he could be, considering all the other responsibilities he had as Prime Minister. Wilberforce intended to present his bill in February of 1788, but by mid-January he and the committee realized that if they were to present a convincing case, they needed to gather a few more pieces of evidence. That was discouraging, but it got worse. By February, it looked as if Wilberforce might die. His digestive system had always been weak, but now he could barely eat, and what he did eat, he could not digest. He began to lose weight rapidly. By late March, his doctor said he would not live more than 2 weeks, 3 at the most. Wilberforce called Pitt to his bedside. "Please," he asked his friend, "will you make the cause of the slaves your own?" Pitt said he would do so gladly. As it turned out, Wilberforce was able to survive his intestinal attack, and over the next several months, he improved enough to at least to begin writing letters and talking with people again. It was almost a year, however, before he was able to return to Parliament. Number 1, what was the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade? And number 2, what kept Wilberforce from presenting his bill when originally planned?